Let me know when we're ready. Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome back to the afternoon session of the second day. We have one topic left, important one, primary financial statements, and I hand over to you, Jan.
Thank you, Andreas, and good afternoon, ISSB members. Agenda Paper 21A continues the ISSB's discussion of the exposure draft proposal to require that an entity that reports operating expenses by function in the statement of profit or loss discloses an analysis of operating expenses by nature in the notes. The staff will not ask the ISSB to make any decisions today, but rather seeks feedback from ISSB members on the scope of future papers. This paper contains 3 questions for ISSB members, which the staff will ask in turn. Now, before we start, I would like to say that it would be very helpful if you could limit your response to the specific question asked to ensure that all aspects of the paper are discussed. From an overall project perspective, the staff would like to highlight that strengthening the disclosure requirements for operating expenses is not critical to achieving the overall objective of this project, which is to improve communication in financial statements. The objective of this paper was to explore whether a partial matrix approach would arrive at a more balanced outcome than the ED proposal with regards to cost for preparers and benefits for users. A partial matrix would mean that specific nature expenses would be disaggregated by function, or that specified functions would be disaggregated into nature expenses based on materiality. The ISSB discussed preparers' cost concerns about the ED proposal at the October 2021 meeting. In addition, the ISSB discussed feedback from some comment letter respondents that had suggested a partial matrix approach as an alternative to the ED proposal. The ISSB then asked the staff to clarify whether there was a common understanding of a partial matrix approach among those suggesting such an approach. Now, the feedback from comment letter respondents indicated that a partial matrix could provide a more balanced outcome between costs and benefits, but the feedback was not enough to conclude what a partial matrix disclosure requirement would look like. The staff have therefore developed 2 variants of a partial matrix for which it sought feedback on in limited outreach with preparers and users. The first variant of a partial matrix, referred to as partial matrix 1, would require specific nature expenses to be disaggregated by function. For example, depreciation, amortization, and employee benefit. The second variant of a partial matrix, referred to as partial matrix 2, would require an entity to disaggregate specified functions, such as cost of sales and selling expenses, into nature expenses based on materiality. Judging from the feedback, the staff think that partial matrix would be less costly than the proposal for some entities. But partial matrix 2 would be even more costly than the proposal for most entities. Preparers have told us that obtaining information on a limited number of specified nature expenses, as would be the case for partial matrix 1, was easier than having to reassess what nature expenses are material in each reporting period, which would be the case for partial matrix 2. In addition, partial matrix 2 would be particularly challenging because it would require entities to unbundle standard costing systems to obtain the necessary information. Whereas for partial matrix 1, information on the amounts of depreciation, amortization, and employee benefits included in each function could be obtained from other systems or through workarounds. When asked about the benefits of a partial matrix compared to the proposal, most users said a partial matrix would provide them with more benefits than the proposal because they were interested in understanding better the composition and cost drivers of specific functions. Many users preferred partial matrix 2 to partial matrix 1, for example, because it would provide them with a full disaggregation of cost of sales. However, users also acknowledged for which version which version provides more benefits largely depends on the business model of the entity. For example, for an asset-heavy industry, they would prefer partial matrix 1. So coming to question 1, the staff would now like to ask ISSB members whether they have any questions or comments on the information gathered about the partial matrix approaches.
Thank you, Jana. Floor open. Any comments, any questions? Tadeo.
Thank you, Andreas. Thank you to the team for the papers. It's just one initial comment. Sorry. It's on paragraph 16. I want to strongly agree with an emphasis that you made in this paragraph. I have the view that companies should already be disclosing the information in the notes about the expenses, the nature. When you present income statement by function, the information of expenses by nature should be in the income statement. And considering this assumption, I agree that this is enough and would not be critical to meeting the project objective if this information was already there. But actually, during the project, I became aware of this diversity in practice, where some believe that the entities are only required to report total for depreciation, amortization, and employee benefits. And then in this regard, thank you very much for the analysis you did and included in Appendix C. With all this in mind, I fully agree that removing this topic, that's what I like to emphasize here, removing this topic from the scope of the project could make current practice worse. It's something that definitely we don't want. And I appreciate and agree with this statement in this paragraph. And in the Appendix C, many companies actually provided a complete analysis of nature expenses, and it suggests me that the information in general is available. I know that some may say that it is not, but this at least suggests me that it should be there, especially because if you just think about what are the main accounting and ERPs, most of the companies have exactly the same. Not very many variations in the market. I mean, that I don't know why some have and some doesn't, especially because I believe the primary or the original accounting entry is by nature, and then it gets into the function. That's why I think that the information is there. But I acknowledge, for example, the problem of the cost and expense, what is incurred or not. I acknowledge the elimination and consolidation. I know all these practical issues, but it's just because the information is there, and I think that it is a matter of getting this information. And again, the analysis in Appendix C show me that in many cases the information is there. It would not be a high cost for companies doing this. But again, I said I acknowledge that might need some adjustment for these systems. And we just said that we had in other papers discussed the possibility of working with a longer transition period. And I think that we really should think about that one. Whatever we go for, full or partial matrix, I think that the longer transition period is something that we have to take and think in the future. Thank you.
Can I just clarify your comments related to the ED proposal? So when you say information is there, did you mean the information in terms of analysis of totals by nature, or you're referring to partial matrix?
No, I'm talking about IS1 today.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
I think that IS1 today already required this. And then you made this comment, could decide in the paragraph 16, could decide to remove this topic. But in the end of the day, you said no way. And then I fully agree with that. That's what I'm trying to emphasize.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anne?
I think the paper is a good response to an issue that's been raised for us, and it's a very important issue, and we've had a lot of discussion about it. So first came up in the consultation that people began informing us that it wasn't so simple to do. And then that alerted us to the relationship to the IAS1 situation, paragraph 104, where there seemed to be some sort of inconsistency, and then your work has shown us that there is diversity in how those words are being read and interpreted, even though there'd be some people who think that there shouldn't be any diversity around those words. So I think this is really helpful for us, and what you've given us on partial matrix 1 and partial matrix 2, because that enables us to discuss a way forward that isn't just what I thought we might have to do in the beginning, where we were hearing so much pushback on this requirement to do the disaggregation when we were doing the outreach. I think the work's been really helpful to identify that users the users, how they're going to use the information and why it's important to them. So it isn't as simply a matter of saying, well, we've heard about costs, so we're not going to go ahead with that. And you've given us some alternatives here and built up this information that we've got. And I found that very useful because you've been very careful in trying to present two alternatives and give us the costing on those. So the question, I'm trying to stay on question. I think the information you've given us is very useful. I think we do have to consider a partial matrix. It's not perfect, it's a compromise. But I think the feedback on our original ED proposals suggests that they're not viable for taking forward. So here we've got these to consider. And one of the factors that really makes me think that we have to look at the partial matrix and today make a decision about whether we can take one forward and develop it further. One of the things that really pushes me towards going for that decision is the point that Tadeu's already made about IAS 1 and 104. I think that there's a new information there that we wouldn't just want to ignore. So I think it's relevant to what we're doing, albeit considering what you've said in paragraph 16, saying that it's not part of primary, the primary objectives of the project. Thank you.
Zen, Bertrand?
First, thank you staff for providing this paper. It's a long one, but I think the subject deserves such an extended paper due to the controversy of the issue. So, and I think, or I perceived the way you presented things as being really objective, trying to provide all the nuances you've gathered while discussing with both users and preparers on this specific subject. So, thank you for the quality of the paper you provided us. First, an introductory comment. Figures provided by companies in primary financial statements or in the notes to the financial statements are not rough approximation, as it's stated by a user in paragraph 32C, or estimations rather than precise amounts, as stated by another one in paragraph 53. Accounting made by a company doesn't work with grosso modo figures. And it's because there is a legal responsibility by the company and its management to provide accurate actual figures, even if those actual figures are derived from an estimate. There are then internal control processes put in place so as to minimize the risk of providing an inaccurate actual figures. So I think it's important to bear that in mind. We are talking about figures and actual real figures, not approximation. Having said that, that is where the complexity is, because it will be the processes put in place will be for companies to provide those accurate figures. And therefore, there was a derived cost and a significant cost if we were to pursue with the proposals in the exposure draft. And it's both a one-off implementation cost and a recurring cost. Each time there will be an evolution in the structure of the company. Each time there will be an evolution in the structure of the expensing or of the expenses of the company. There will be ongoing costs incurred by the company to be in a position to provide a full matrix. So I think full matrix, as Anne mentioned, it's impossible to pursue that approach. Partial matrix is still a challenge and can still be a challenge. But I mean, I agree with Anne. As Anne mentioned, we need to find a way to compromise on this issue. And probably, I think then approach one is the most operational way of going forward And it's probably something that may be operationalized for companies, even those that in the industrial world base their accounting on standard costing systems, which we know that those are the companies that face the most challenges towards any kind of breakdown of expenses by nature when they present a P&L by function. So I think approach one, focusing on the requirements already existing in IS1 to present total certain nature of expenses, the total of certain expenses by nature, such as amortization, depreciation, impairment, or personal costs, for instance, maybe probably more easily operationalized. There will still be cost, but I think there's certainly, as you pointed out in paragraph 50 of your paper, there's probably a way to have those accepted by most companies. So it will probably lead to faster implementation of the new standards. I agree with what you said, you wrote in paragraph 63 in this instance, and derives from what you wrote in paragraph 64, there may be more adherence by preparers to our requirements, or at a minimum, there may be less non-adherence. I don't know if there will be adherence, but at minimum, we could have less non-adherence. So I think it's also an important consideration to have for us when we decide the best way to move forward with this issue.
Thank you, and my thanks to the team for pursuing this initiative. I think that the catalyst here is very much hearing back from preparers in terms of trying to find solutions to a proposal that they didn't like in the exposure draft, and trying to come up with something that could help us still move forward. And just to quote the French preparer organisations, and they're very clear, in response to the needs of some users, it might be sufficient to ask preparers to provide more detail about the nature of expenses such as employee benefit services, depreciation and amortization expenses, impairment losses. So very clear on that. And I think, I'll resist talk about partial matrix 1 versus 2 until the next question. But just on the cost, I was involved in one outreach call with a major European company where we were told, I believe, that it would take 2 years to implement the ED proposal, or that they'd like to early adopt the ED, but it would take them 2 years to do that. And the statement was, if you put a gun to my head, I could do a partial matrix in 2 days. Now, they have a bit of a head start and they collect some of this data already, but it's just that contrast. I'm not saying that could be, but these are quite stark in terms of just receiving that message.
Mary?
A few thoughts about this. One is subject to Juliana's assessment that this is an issue but not critical path to the overall objective of the project. If we are to do something in this area, I think we have to do something that requires a level of quantification. We can't just rely on narrative discussion or description. So if we're going to do something, I think we have to find a way to do something with some quantification. And I also think we shouldn't be constrained to how do we work within the existing requirements, whether they're fully applied or not, which focus on depreciation and amortization in employee benefits. Not saying that we should, try to require everything or a full matrix, but in standard setting, especially for new standards, big project, we get to change things as opposed to we have to work within, the constraints of what's done currently. So I think we should be, whether it's for 1 or for 2, thinking about what are the information, what are the items that are most important for users in a disaggregation, And it may turn out that it's employee benefits, depreciation, and amortization, and that's fine. But I just want us to have thought about it rather than saying we can't go beyond that current population in our thinking about cost benefit in terms of an improvement in this area. I do think we should pick up a lesson from our disclosure initiative, and I know we haven't done the full discussion of how are we going to proceed with that project, but I think a message that I've heard through the outreach on that was that preparers found it quite useful to have us articulate what the purpose of the disclosure objective was. What kind of analysis were we trying to enable, so that they could think about, is there another way to provide, that was in the context of DI, it was so that they could think about whether there's another way to satisfy that requirement if they had a better understanding of what we were trying to enable. And so I kept coming back to the question in this paper is, or at the beginning of the paper, you said, one of the things that users are trying to do is understand how, let's say, cost of sales might respond to changing economic events. And it might depend on whether it's all pretty much one thing, one kind of component, or if it has a labor component and a materials component, et cetera, it might respond quite differently. So if I understand what kind of analysis we're trying to do, I think I'd have better insight about partial matrix 1 and partial matrix 2. Nick, you said that you had the soundbite that really hit you of 2 years to do one versus 2 days to do the other. Well, the thing that would really help me is, I care most about being able to do my own sensitivity, of cost of sales or employee benefits or whatever it is, or I care most about knowing to what extent it's a single item versus, basically it's all labor costs, or it's, a mix of items in a complex cost allocation. I don't know. So those are, when you say to me, do I have any questions or concerns? I think in terms of evaluating them, when, you come back and ask us to make decisions, if we could say what we want to be able to do is at least deliver X, then I think that would be good. It would be helpful to me. I also agree, and this is something I think it turned up within the question 1, so I think I'm legit in making this comment now. And the analysis supporting question 1 is, I think we should say explicitly that rather than say there's an overarching requirement for all material information and you have to figure out what's material, we're going to specify what you have to do. And in respect of this components, we're not saying you are, of course, allowed to provide more information, but if you comply with the whatever specific requirement we have, that provides relief from and also consider what other information is material. And I think we have to do that to manage the cost of this, and that's part of the trade-off. Now, you've talked in a couple of places about in theory, the risk of less information than today because of that overarching requirement, which in theory applies. I think that's probably more hypothetical than widely invoked and applied in practice, because I think what we see is relatively little disaggregation of the kind that we're talking about in either partial matrix approach in response to the general requirement for additional information if it's I'm not going to use the right word. I think it's relevant. So I think it's right to think about it in the abstract, but I don't weight that very much, because I think it's more hypothetical than real in terms of improving practice today. So when you say, do you have any questions or comments? It's, if you can articulate, of course, first of all, I'd like to go for the one that is less expensive and more doable and won't slow down, slow down the project. That sounds, why would we not want to do that? But let's make sure it enables the analysis that we think is most important, or whether it's too hard to address that. And for the progress of the project as a whole, we have to, challenge whether we can do something. I think this is another place where we can say, don't let the great be the enemy of the good. And there may be times when, as we look at things like the two matrix approaches, if people are worried about getting down to the last dollar or euro or pound or whatever to do the precise analysis, and we have all the practical implications of standard cost systems that reallocate, et cetera, is it more important to know the approximate percentage that's labor versus the approximate percentage that's depreciation and amortization? And would having that, which might be a lot easier, less costly to deliver, help? That's the other thing I'd ask you to think about as you say, how do we come to a final recommendation? But I think we should try to do something. But if you say it's not absolutely mission critical to the PFS project overall, I think we should try, but maybe, one more meeting so we don't let it derail things. I'd rather do the one that's less expensive, but I'd rather know that it was delivering the information that we think is going to be used. And I think we should tee it up as a relief from the general requirement for all material information so that it isn't seen as giving, with one hand and then backdoor imposing a very high cost. So those are some reactions and questions and comments.
John?
I also appreciate staff's efforts to develop alternatives and to reach out to the preparers and the users to test your proposal. I think in terms of, because I think first thing that we should make it very clear what's the objective we are going to do. I think the objective, we try to respond to concerns raised by the stakeholders on our exposure of the proposal in the exposure draft. Their concerns about cost arising from preparers. Obviously, users also still need useful information, particularly those disaggregated information. So I think our objective, we try to develop some kind of, I think you mentioned some kind of balanced approach that is reduce the cost for preparers, but still maintain the useful information to the users. So I think based on that objective, I think paragraph 75 particularly mentioned it. I think this is the key to guide us to develop our alternative approach and to explore, and to decide which approach would meet this objective. Secondly, I do have two conceptual concerns raised by some stakeholders. One is about the usefulness of consolidative information and, segmental level information, particularly mentioned in paragraph 54. Because 54 said that one preparer and some users question the usefulness of consolidated information. And some users said that they would prefer information on the segmental level. I think it's a conceptual issue, Actually, obviously we try to develop or request company to develop disaggregated information. Consolidated information is still useful. For example, the total depreciation, total amortization, total impairment loss, or total employee benefit. Currently, we already require company to provide. Does not that mean those information are not useful? I think users still need those information. If we did not disclose, how can they find those information? For example, they needed EBITDA or something like that, they need to make adjustment. So I think conceptually we need to make clear that consolidated or aggregated information or disaggregation may provide different role in terms of meeting the user's needs. Secondly is that what kind of role will play of business model and specific industries in terms of deciding which partial metrics we need to decide or move forward or to explore. Because also in paragraph 56 said that some users and one ISSB members prefer that, prefer some kind of approach we choose a partial matrix one based on those industry, which is heavy assets, heavy entities, and then partial matrix two based on those, software, service, business entities, something like that. I think we should be very careful to go to that route because I think it's very difficult to decide. For example, particularly many companies have multiple, businesses, and also particularly, for example, it seems that for heavy, assets, entities, the depreciation and employment benefits would be mostly important for them. And then we say for those software service business and those information may be not so important. I think particularly for employment benefit, for service industry, I think that is one of the most important expenses they have. So I hope that obviously some people raise this concern, but when we explore our approach, I don't think business model or industries should play a role in this case. We need some kind of uniform, consistent approach to explore. Our discussion focus on question one or others? Yeah, just one. Okay. So yeah, I would. Okay. Thank you. Just.
Bruce?
Thanks very much, and thanks to the staff for this. I mean, once again, it's been quite a roller coaster, I think, in terms of getting people. And I will tell you this: I think this paper takes us a long way to getting there. I mean, I think this is a really good response to the challenges we've had, and I feel like I'm repeating what I said earlier today. But it's once again one of the situations where we've got a range of things and we need to come down somewhere. And I think this is getting us to a stage where I think we've got a solution that's going to be acceptable across the board. I mean, my view is clearly 104 is not giving us what we need or what users are needing in terms of financials, and so we need to do something. And I think the approaches that you're taking, you start getting us to a stage where I think we can hopefully get that information into their hands. A couple of things I just want to highlight. I mean, the one is I agree with the analysis around the disaggregation principle. And I mean, I just think we need to make sure that we clearly articulate what we mean. We don't want people getting confused thinking, I need to apply this and of course, how does the disaggregation then overlay onto that? And I think you've drawn that out in paragraph 29. And I just think we need to be very conscious that wording needs to filter through, that we're not going to overly confuse people in terms of, well, if I've done this, do I now need to apply the general disaggregation principle over and above it? I think that could create a bit of a challenge. The other thing I also just kind of was, maybe it's a question or comment, I'm not quite sure, but I mean, what I was trying to work out here is our intention, which I would hope it isn't, but is our intention to restrict companies who want to give a full matrix? Because, are we going to specify? So I guess it's kind of a two-part question, and Juliana, I'm conscious of your warning, so I'm not going to step into question two. It relates to it slightly. I'm nervous now. But the question is, what if so let's assume, I mean, are we saying we're going to only require, say, the first option, or would we allow somebody to do the second one? Would we allow somebody to do a full one on the second one? So are we talking about setting a minimum baseline for what we'd require? Or are we talking, this is the format you will all do it in? So that's the one thing I just guess I was kind of thinking in my mind is, I mean, I appreciate the analysis of kind of the first and second options that we've given in there. I mean, even though I have a preference for the first, I just sit there and think, well, if I was some prepare out there going, actually, the way my system's written, doing it the second way proposed, just a lot easier. My information's there, I could do it, and I want to do a full matrix on that approach. Would we allow that, or are we going to restrict that? So that's kind of just the only thing I wasn't quite sure. Is this a baseline, or is this the requirement?
Well, I think generally it's something we would have to discuss in a follow-up paper. Of course, it's a very good question. I think this case could happen that one entity says, actually, I can actually provide this information, but not the other information. But I think it's something that generally, I would not think we would want to prohibit people from giving more information rather than less. But like I said, I think we would have to do more analysis on this in a further paper.
Okay. Thanks.
Zach?
Bruce, you stole my thought. So what I was going to talk about was I was able to participate in a lot of these discussions, which the team organized, and I was really grateful for that. I think I can say unequivocally that the feedback was users would prefer a full matrix by segment. So just so we know where the user request level is on this, but that's not possible right now because the feedback we heard from preparers was nuanced, with some saying with our current systems, we could turn this on and do it tomorrow, the full matrix. Others saying what was in the proposal, they could do tomorrow. And you lose people as you go or gain people, depending on your perspective of who can do what and how long it will take to get there. So I thought the staff did a great job of thinking through where the curve was and where we could set the curve to bring enough people along so that we're getting the right direction of travel. But my comment was going to be, I think it's important when we do this that we contextualize all of these moves as direction of travel. So as more information is available, as ERP systems have really developed over the last 10, 15 years, all of this analysis is becoming more and more possible. And the challenge we were looking to solve was we'd like to get here, but not all the systems are there today. So we talked about, do we do an extended timeline? What else can we do? So if our approach here is to say, this is what we think is possible, pushes the envelope a bit today, making it clear that going beyond is acceptable to me is welcome, and also making clear that we think systems are going to be more and more able to do this in the future is important.
Yep. I have 3 comments. One is about the general principle of disaggregation. I think it will be really helpful for us to understand the kind of the deviation between the general principle of disaggregation requirement and then whatever the exemption you might, or option or requirement we might use going forward as part of our standards. That understanding will help us to think about how can we locate that requirement of option within the whole principle of general requirement of disaggregation. And another thing is when I think about partial matrix 2 approach, I think if there is only 2 or 3 by function line items on the face of the statement of financial performance, in that case, if we say you need to disaggregate the cost of sale and selling expenses, that means we almost ask those companies to do a full matrix analysis rather than the partial matrix analysis. So I think that will not be a cost relief for those companies if they have a very limited number of bifunction line items. And then another thing is it's the point raised by Jin Chao on paragraph 56. I think if there is no specific jurisdictional preference of choosing the bifunction and the by nature, probably if the companies had prominently engaged in manufacturing business, maybe those companies prefer to use by function analysis rather than by nature analysis. But in the case, if the company engages prominently in kind of the software service or some sort of service, maybe those companies prefer using the by nature analysis rather than by function analysis, because those companies usually use project management cost accounting rather than manufacturing cost accounting. So I think there is a kind of the compatibility of the accounting and how they present operating expense.
Thank you. I think that gives us pretty good steer for the next. Sorry.
Very briefly to say that I fully agree with what Rika said on if we were to ask breakdowning cost of sales and selling expenses by nature, I see no difference. And I've already stated that last time we discussed. I see no difference, like Rika mentioned, with a full matrix. It will be as costly. There is no cost relief for preparers. I totally agree with Rika. And a caution on what Zach said towards betting on the future evolution of ERP system. That is a forward-looking statement. Sorry, but I wouldn't rely on putting a forward-looking statement in our requirements, standard requirements.
What he really meant was actually breakdown of CGUs, but
I was just trying to have a long-term view.
Yeah, but on this, I rely on what Mary said, which is the best.
Great. Don't let the great be the enemy of the good.
Yes. Okay, that's why I would be more short term.
can we have that on record?
No, on this specific subject. On this specific subject.
I would like a playback, folks.
As you can see, there is still a reluctance with me, and I'm totally consistent, whatever the subject, on providing forward-looking statements or information.
Okay, shall we move to the second part?
Thank you, Andres. So one of the objectives of this project is to improve the quality of disaggregation in financial statements. The ED proposal would strengthen the current disclosure requirement for operating expenses in IS1 because there is diversity in views as to what IS1 requires. The staff analyzed whether a partial matrix would also strengthen the requirements in IS1. Overall, a partial matrix would strengthen some aspects of IS1 while possibly weakening other aspects. Specifically, partial matrix 1 would strengthen IS1 for depreciation, amortization, and employee benefits, because these nature expenses would be required to be disaggregated by function. But could weaken IS1 for additional information, because nature expenses other than those specified would no longer be required. Partial matrix 2 would strengthen IS1 for additional information, because more information than depreciation, amortization, and employee benefits would be required for specific function, but could weaken IS1 in two ways. Firstly, because totals of depreciation, amortization, and employee benefits would no longer be automatically given, and secondly, because not all functions would be disaggregated into nature expenses. However, current practice shows that many entities do not provide the analysis that would be required by partial matrix 1 or partial matrix 2 today. Therefore, the staff think that a partial matrix disclosure requirement would improve current practice. The staff analyzed which partial matrix is likely to provide a better balance of costs and benefits compared to the proposal. The ISP could, of course, explore partial matrix 2 further on the basis of providing additional benefits to users. However, the staff do not suggest the ISP further explores partial matrix 2 because doing so would not be responsive to the feedback relating to cost concerns, could be considered a fundamental change to the ED proposal and thus delay the project, and would not significantly contribute to meeting project objectives. In contrast, the staff think that partial matrix 1 is worth exploring further because partial matrix 1 is expected to result in the disclosure of additional material information by many entities and thus improve current practice. And the preparer feedback suggests that even for entities that do not already provide this information, it could be provided without undue cost. So coming to question 2, the staff would now like to ask ISB members whether they have any questions or comments on the staff plan on which partial matrix to explore in the next papers.
I agree with you exploring partial matrix 1 for the reasons that you outline in this section of the paper, and it's a lot to do with what information will be provided under that approach and the cost of that, the ability of preparers to do it. So although in outreach or in the consultation on this, the various consultations you held, we did hear some people say they preferred partial matrix 2 and that would meet their needs better. I think we have to look overall at the costs and proceed with investigating something that will still fit within this project so that we can go ahead. But as I read this part of the paper, I did have questions about how it works for an entity of the other type. And Jen Chow's already paragraph referenced where under question 1, where we're talking about an entity from a different industry, such as software as a service, where these particular line items that we're talking about specifying are not necessarily the ones that are relevant. So as we can investigate partial matrix 1 further, I would like to hear more about how we're going to handle the fact that this approach means it doesn't work for all entities. And this approach is actually different to how we often approach it. We often set up things where people can provide the information that's relevant for them rather than specifying particular line items. Here, we're going with the specifying line items approach for all the reasons that we've been discussing. So I would like to know more in the next paper and so forth. As you explore this, I'd like to know more how we're going to accommodate the types of industries that don't necessarily have those items as particularly relevant things. Do they just leave them out and it's a 0, and do they put something else in? So I've been thinking about that. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. Nick.
Thanks. Just first of all, to respond to Anne's point, which I think is valid and worth considering. But I wonder if it's quite a small subset of companies that are, because these would be businesses that have largely outsourced everything they're doing. I'm not saying they don't exist, but I think often you find businesses which are asset heavy, maybe people light, and then the inverse is true. So we kind of capture that point there. And then just to follow up on what Rika said, often with I guess the type of software business, the service business, it may be a by nature presenter anyway, so it becomes irrelevant. But it's certainly worth exploring. Absolutely. My preference is aligned with the staff of partial matrix 1 for 3 reasons. First of all, the cost is the first thing. So let's take that as given. The second one, and hopefully it partly addresses Mary's question around how does this help the user? And from my perspective, compared to where we were with the ED, where you had one P&L by nature and one P&L by function, you couldn't really relate to each other. They sat there in parallel. They would have the same starting point and the same total at the bottom, but really no connection between them. Here, if I'm a by function presenter, I then have this extra piece of disaggregation, which then allows me to connect back to the cash flow statement in terms of forecasting my depreciation and amortization. So for me, it's much more about joined up forecasting and internally consistent forecasting rather than doing these things sort of in isolation. As I would, today, if I was forecasting for a by function presenter, I'd have to create my own EBITDA line basically, so I can then link over to the cash flow statement. This provides me with an immediate link to those 2 key lines in the cash flow statement: depreciation and amortization, and then clearly I'd be linking operating profit as the next thing down. So that really helps me, I have to say. And the second thing is that users always feel much more comfortable where, and I hope I'm not peeping ahead to question 3, but where you can get to a position where you can reconcile the information you're given to totals. And actually, it's much easier to do that under partial matrix 1 than it is under partial matrix 2 because of the whole cost and expense issue. So for those reasons, I think it still has utility to continue to explore.
Thanks, Nick. Tadeo?
Thank you, Andreas. I think that I agree with the staff's approach, exploring matrix 1. As Rika said, and Bertrand confirmed, that when I look at matrix 2, I mean that doing matrix 2 and going for a full matrix probably is the same. If they have the information, they probably would have for everything. And I really think that matrix 2 is too costly if we think that this is an important barrier. I definitely think that partial matrix 1 is the best way to initially explore. And similar to Nick, try to not fall into temptation to go to question 3. And then I will stop here.
Remind me not to bring him back in. Mary.
Thinking about the way the staff has framed it, I agree with their assessment that it's only partial matrix 1 that is worth carrying forward because of kind of the strikes that have been set up against partial matrix 2. And it's very helpful to hear from Nick about what analysis that partial matrix 1 would enable. His comments did remind me that I think I've been assuming, and I'd like to set out that I think we should continue to also require, even in the context of partial matrix 1, if we go that route, the total amount of the line items, whatever they are, let's say depreciation and amortization and employee benefits, so that it would be clear what hasn't been disaggregated into the line items identified. I mean, very often in life you have an other line item, and let's just know what the size of the other is rather than it being the missing piece. And then the second thing I wanted to flag, this is a second order comment, not prime, but you report in paragraph 79, so fairly within question 2, that some would prefer to do this by segments, but you think that this is outside the scope of this project. I agree that reconsidering segments is outside the scope of the project. I would not want us to spend time exploring whether to require it to be done as part of the segment analysis. But I could see saying, if you want to provide the required disaggregation in connection with providing your segment note, this would be permitted. It's just an observation about what's permitted, and if somebody finds that easier, then allow it. I just think I'd want to write it in such a way that you can't have one piece of the disaggregation in the segment note and the other pieces in another note. But if there are some who disaggregate already on the basis of segments, why not let them do it, in that one place? I'm talking about permitting, not requiring, and it's kind of an observation and then move on. It's not the basis for our standard setting. I see Neely immediately starting to swat up on books, and I bet she's thinking about whether or not that would be consistent with the management approach and putting other information in there, but I don't know that I'm reading her mind properly.
I was just trying to connect back to some conversations that we had with regulators on management performance measures and how that intersects with segments, and there were things that were getting some regulators squeamish, and I couldn't remember if that was one of them.
And that there was the point that we discussed in other papers, in that the ISB will not, generally our policy has been not say what additional information is permitted, because that implies then that
if it's not expressly permitted.
So that's been generally our, and there is a general requirement. Almost.
So it's perhaps more commented a basis for conclusion that this is one of the suggestions made, and we decided not to pursue it because we weren't going to require it, but of course nothing precludes
it. Is the reason for that, Mary, to Tadeo's point he made in earlier discussion in this concern that there is this good practice we have seen that's actually quite there, big numbers are reporting and concerned that if we go with, quite narrow approach, if we don't say anything about this good practice, that good practice might disappear. Is that
it was more a direct response to the first sentence of paragraph 79. Some users find nature expenses disaggregated by segment more useful. Some preparers may be able to obtain information more easily. So why not let them do it? Yeah, it is that simple and that basic. Don't let it be a distraction.
66% are doing it today already, so arguably.
So it's maybe more an observation in the basis or conclusion that while we decided not to require, to pursue requiring it, we also did not mean to signal to include it.
Okay.
Yes, I agree with the staff to pursue with partial matrix approach for the reasons expressed by notably Nick and Tadeo. And on all this discussion, Mary just mentioned, and on the previous question, some of my fellow board members raised, I wouldn't go beyond anything else in the standard as a prescription. And so if someone is already providing a full matrix, nobody in the standard will nobody will prevent the company to present the information. So why flagging it in the standard itself?
Chinchon?
Thank you. Yes, as I mentioned previously, I think because the objective of developing partial metric is try to reduce the cost of disclose those information relating to operating expenses. In the meantime, also provide useful information. So based on that objective, I also support partial metrics 1 because it's less costly, but still provide useful information. Obviously, partial metrics 2, as Tadeu mentioned, it's really costly. It maybe end up for some company to require them to develop, 4 or disclose 4 metrics. So I support that. Secondly, as I think Anne mentioned a very good point, because if we focus on partial metrics A, so how to identify and specify those items of those operating nature, the operating expenses, become key, So currently we say, okay, depreciation, amortization, employee benefits, or other items. Obviously, or maybe this is relevant to question 3, but I would like to mention here, yeah. And let's be thinking about, Rika also mentioned before, for example, currently, because of pandemic, maybe some companies, simply just ask all the employees work from home. So that means no office building needed. So no depreciation, maybe depreciation, no total number of depreciation maybe will be 0. So this kind of case could happen. So how to help us to, to develop or to identify those items? I think currently we are looking at those companies. Currently, they present operating expenses by function in the face of the performance statement, and develop a proposal how they needed to disclose the information by nature in the notes. But Rika mentioned that obviously some companies actually present those operating expenses by nature in the face of the financial statement, performance statement. Maybe we can look at those companies, what kind of line item they disclose, and can help us to identify whether additional, items beyond depreciation, amortization, employee benefit needed. So obviously, impairment loss, I think we can have, because based on the initial research we did in the Appendix C, actually some companies already disclose the information about impairment losses, but whether any other items we can find to look at the face of the performance statement, those companies actually present the items by nature. I think that will be really helpful.
This goes back to, I think several of you made a point of, it really becomes specific, and following this approach, I think it becomes very difficult because there are lots of examples of companies where these maybe wouldn't be the top items, or maybe they would be, but there would be incremental items that would be quite important. And I'm not quite sure. Joanna has been doing lots of work with Aquila, and continuing to do that work, but I'm not sure. It's almost like you're trying to fit everything into this list. It is just not. It's not going to work. There will be loss of material information. So I think the board, and I think it's back to your point, and you were making earlier, and Mary and many others, that, is this something, where is the acceptability? We certainly can provide few examples. I can tell you there's lots of companies that this won't touch the surface. But is our objective to make a list of 50 items that would capture then, a higher percentage of the companies? I didn't think that was the board's objective. So, yeah, it's just, entity, really to determine material information as entity-specific approach, you would just have to say this is the objective and let companies go and find what is the material. And this approach is quite, it will never achieve that objective to capture all the material information. I think there's something to be clear. We can go and do as much as research as we can. There will always be something that will be missed because at the end it's entity specific. Depends on how the business is run, and also it will change over time as examples you were just giving. So we are doing lots of research. I'm just saying don't expect miracles from this research we're doing.
I think it would be important is actually link it back to what Nick said in response to Mary. What's the objective, right? The objective, as I heard Nick say, is not necessarily to get the key items, right, and have a breakdown there, but really to enable the linkage between the statement of performance and the cash flow statement, right? So if that's the key objective, I think that objective stays regardless of the size of the item, because it is the nature of the expense item that you're looking for, right? What I can't tell, obviously, is this the only objective, right? And there may be other objectives. And if other objectives are looking more towards the significance of the items where the breakdown is required, then obviously these items or this discussion becomes relevant. But if I treat just Nick as a proxy and say that is the key point, I want to really relate the two statements, then I think size is not an issue. It's really the nature of the item, I would think. Bruce.
Thanks. I've got a preference for Matrix 1 for the reasons have been given, so I'm not going to sit and repeat those. I guess the only question in my mind, and I know it's touched a bit on 3, but it kind of relates to that, is just leading on from what I'd said earlier. If the intention is only to allow the 1, then I'd pursue partial 1 and not do it. My question would be, what I'd want to understand is, if somebody wanted to do partial Matrix 2, if we're going to allow it, I guess what I'd be interested in understanding then is, what does that create a problem that people could use 2 different types of partial matrices? And is that going to impede comparability? Is that going to create a challenge? Or do we think practice will develop in terms of different industries in which case it is? So that's something I'd want to understand, because I think understanding if we're only allowing the 1 method or potentially people have got a 2 method would depend on the answer for question 2. Are we going to just look at the 1, or are we potentially going to look at 2?
So are you saying either or, Bruce, in terms of maybe going back, maybe I'm making a link when there's no link, thinking to what Mary was saying earlier, just kind of focus more on the objectives and then allow, I don't want to say choice, it's not choice, but allow approach that maybe.
That's kind of what I'm getting to is question 2 is phased around, well, which one do we like, 1 or 2? And I'm saying it's a bit difficult for me to sit and say, I would prefer 1 because I think it's easier and all the reasons that we're given are there. My fear is, as I said, if somebody wants to give 2, and from what I've understood from the feedback, users saying, look, 2 gives us more information. Would we stop somebody doing that? And if the question is we wouldn't, then I think we have to take an objectives-based approach and not focus as much about how they do the matrix. Whereas if we're saying, no, we're only going to do 1 type of matrix, well, then let's do 1. You can't do 2, and then we don't have to worry about that. So we kind of need to have the one direction, or what we're going to apply before I can say to you whether I would want to know more about 1 or 2, or both.
I just want to clarify one thing. So the preparer feedback we have received so far, nobody said they can do the partial matrix 2. So I appreciate some users said it is more beneficial for them, but what's kind of for me on offer is either some sort of ED proposal with a cost relief or a partial matrix 1, because the partial matrix 2, nobody said that they have any solution to going through basically the ED proposal and then disaggregating by function. That is just something that they won't be able to do. So I don't really know. I understand the discussion. It all makes sense, but it's just kind of, we don't really have this opportunity to.
No, I'm happy with that as an answer. What I'm trying to work out is that what we're proposing? Because if what we're proposing is it's 1 or 2, and from what we've gathered, consensus sounds to be like it's around 1. Then my understanding is, leaving from this meeting, you're only going to work on 1, and that is the one we're going to require. I just want to check I've got the thinking right. So if a company came and said, we want to do matrix 2, we would say, no, you have to do it in terms of matrix one. That's what you're saying.
Maybe not so bluntly, Bruce. Sorry, I know.
But then if they've got the option to do two, then we need to explore it.
Yeah, and maybe we have, because in trying to simplify discussion, we went for this 1 and 2, but of course there's infinite variance between two you can think of. And just going back to your question, Jean-Charles, and I have in mind this company for whom packaging is really big input to the cost. And they, for example, might say, if ISSB went to specify partial matrix 1, they say, well, actually, why don't we also provide disclosure of what packaging materials cost are included in cost of sales, for example. So that is one plus, I would say. And I wouldn't see anything going against that, and that could be the outcome. And also partly depends, I don't want to jump into question 3, because these are all other questions we're going to have to ask the board, because I think Mary and some others referenced to, was it paragraph 29, when we said the assumption in the discussion here is that with partial matrix 1, all other principles of desegregation fall out. But that was just working assumption for writing this paper. We still have to go through that discussion with you and to say, what does this mean specifically and how do we make it all work? It's quite simplistic assumption to say you do this and you do nothing else. And it really scares me to, even be considering this approach, to be honest. So it's all, sorry, Bruce, we can't say yes or no. It's, I think, to Juliana's point, something as partial matrix 2, which will be complete analysis of a subset as an approach, is clearly something that's not going to work. So from that basis, we are saying we don't want to pursue it, but it could be partial matrix 1 plus, depending on future papers, right?
Yeah, I just think that the challenge for me is kind of where you guys go from here, because if you're saying, well, we're just going to pursue a whole lot of different matrices, are we going to come back next meeting with 5 variants that are available? 3, I'm just trying to work out.
It's maybe we driving towards? Maybe let's have another round when we go to question 3, because that includes, what exactly will be in the next paper or sets of papers.
Rika?
Yes, I have to stop and focus on question 2. I think if we focus the objective of pursuit of matrix 1 and 2, a kind of the thinking about a good compromise solution to find cost relief. In that way, I don't think a matrix 2 can be a good answer, because it's more like a pursuit of principle of disaggregation rather than, so meaning that matrix 2 is almost equivalent to a full analysis of operating expenses by function and by nature. So I don't think that can be a great answer for cost relief compromise. So I think if staff continue looking at some kind of the partial matrix, I will ask the staff to just focus on matrix 1 for that objective. And then I truly want to only think about 3 specified items identified in paragraph 104 of IS1. And then think about how far we need to compromise between the usefulness information and then cost relief raised by the preparers as a concern. And then how we can put that option or requirement in the final standards requirement about disaggregation of operating expense. That's something I want to visualize, how this idea can be located in the whole picture.
Yeah, we want to visualize that too.
Thank you. Okay, Bertrand?
No, just to my view on that, I know it will be a long slide, but Rika just said, trying to answer to Bruce, let's prescribe a partial matrix 1 approach, and that's all. I mean, Having said that, it doesn't mean that someone willing to provide a full matrix won't be able to provide it. And being able to provide a full matrix means that they will be able to provide partial matrix 1 approach. There's no doubt about it. And as Rika mentioned, as partial matrix 2 is very equivalent in terms of burden to full matrix, it's very likely, not sure like the full matrix, but very likely that they will be in a position to provide the information relating to partial matrix 1. So I would just require and explore partial matrix 1 and stop there. And the rest, if they want to provide, they are free to provide. Nobody will be, they won't be prevented to present that. I appreciate what Ida said. Maybe we can discuss one additional item on top of amortization, depreciation, and personal costs. But let's keep it simple.
Mary?
Thank you.
I too am responding to Bruce's comment about do we have to pick one? And the only thing you're asking us for, you're not asking us for decisions at this meeting, is input into thinking about what to bring next. To me, it would be preferable to say, here's the analysis we're trying to enable, something, and then basically set out partial matrix 1 would satisfy it. But if you have another way, for example, partial matrix 2 of satisfying that, basically rather than saying you come back to us with a proposal to require partial matrix 1 as the requirement, say, if you can find a way to articulate clearly enough what the objective is and the characteristics, but then go on to say, here's partial matrix 1, this will satisfy that. So people have certainty and clarity, assuming that that's your conclusion, that partial matrix 1 would satisfy it, that, and you recommend that that's what we say, then do that. But if we express the requirement in terms of provide information that disaggregates at least the following items between the functional, the primary functional line items, we could make the observation that to Bruce's point, we are not precluding partial matrix 2 as the way of satisfying it. We just understand that most would find it more cost effective and easier to do 1. But that's just to your question, what do you want us to think about as we develop a proposal? And I just say, think about whether you can express it in a more abstract way, but I would say, and then back that up by saying this partial matrix 1 would satisfy that, just so there's no question for people about whether that's enough.
Could I just come in on that? Because I think that sounds a really lovely idea, but the problem is that partial matrix 1 combines satisfying an objective of the information needs of users with a cost relief for preparers. And, we can't.
I get it, and that's fine, and that may be why you come back to us and say we're not recommending going that route.
Yeah,
because it's not possible to. But at the table, in responses to Bruce's question, I'm not sure that if you went off and thought about it, you couldn't, you couldn't identify it. But if you do, that's fine.
Because then it means that if we have this combination of an objective plus a cost relief, then to say that entities can find their own alternatives, they don't know how to get that combination of the satisfying the objective and giving themselves a cost relief. That balance has to come from us. So I think that's the problem of trying to be more general about.
What if we put a presumption in to say the presumption is that matrix 1 gets you there? And if you want to do something else.
But what would the something else?
If there's a different way they want to.
I mean, unless we said the something else is to give a complete disaggregation.
And that may be.
A full matrix. And of course, we'd never stop anyone. It's almost like we don't need to say that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that is the difficulty of falling back on principles, lovely as it sounds, is that we're trying to give a cost relief as well as satisfying some principles.
But I think Bruce had a valid question. As I think about it at the table, I say to you to go away and think about it. And if your conclusion is it's not operable because of the combined with cost relief, then just say that to us when you bring back a recommendation, the next time.
Consider that now.
It's a very interesting discussion. Most people have said for you to come back with a version of partial matrix 1. And I think if we give you that kind of direction as your primary, what you're working on, albeit you've heard other things, I think that's important that you know what the primary thing you're working on, because you still have to look at how you're going to handle the materiality situation that currently exists. And as referenced in the paper, you've talked about that you've made a working assumption that those materiality requirements would seem to be satisfied if people have done this, but that's going to come up again in the next paper. So I think the idea that you're working with partial matrix 1 makes it easier to then address those other things that need to be addressed. So that's why I support partial matrix 1.
Nick.
Yeah, I'm just wary of rabbit holes here, because I think the only way to satisfy partial matrix 1 via partial matrix 2 is the full matrix, which kind of takes us back to where again, not prohibited, but I don't think there's anything more to say than that. Perhaps that's all you need to do, but I'm just saying, please don't spend lots of time researching to get to that answer.
Yes. Yeah. And I don't think we're saying that. To reiterate what Mary was saying, I mean, I'm asking the question. If and I can see Anne's knows what her answer is going to be. We're going to do this, and that's fine. If we're saying that's the only option, that's great. Then we know what we're going to focus on. So I'm not saying I'm advocating for something else. I'm just trying to understand kind of what box we're putting people in.
And I just would like to emphasize the fact that I fully agree
I'm eagerly recording that. I may play that back in good world. But anyway, okay, can we move to question 3 then?
So the staff plan to do further research of entities' current practice of disclosing nature expenses to help the ISSB assess the likely effects of a partial matrix 1 disclosure requirement for entities compared to the ED proposal. For example, research shows that many entities provide a complete analysis of totals of nature expenses, but most do not. Research also shows that some entities disaggregate depreciation, amortization, employee benefits, or impairments by function. The staff do not think that additional outreach with preparers or users is needed for the ISSB to make a decision. Paragraph 84 describes the questions that would need to be addressed in the next paper. For example, if the ISSB decides to require a partial matrix 1, it would need to discuss the specifics of such an approach, such as should more nature expenses than depreciation, amortization, and employee benefits be required? To what extent would totals of nature expenses be required? And also, regardless of the approach taken, the ISSB would need to decide on the relationship between the general principle of disaggregation and specific disclosure requirements. For example, would the best way to avoid a full matrix be to clarify that an entity that complies with the specific disclosure requirement is not required to also apply the general principle? Or should the general principle still apply, but with the cost relief? The ISSB would also need to decide whether it wants to give application guidance, for example, with regards to whether disclosed amounts should be cost amounts rather than expense amounts. So now coming to the last question, the staff would like to ask ISSB members whether they have any questions or comments on the planned next steps. Specifically, is there additional research you would suggest or additional questions the staff should analyze?
Before I open the floor, let me just set my expectations on this one. And I would really urge us thoroughly follow from what Nick just said, reminding us of scope creep and rabbit holes. I think a lot of research has already been carried out. And I think we really need to be mindful as to how much more can be done. I think we have now found something that seems like a practical solution. We can always try to search for the Holy Grail, but I think if this satisfies it, especially taking into account that this is not a make or break thing for the entire project, let's be reasonable. That will be my plea really to board members on this one. On that happy note, I wasn't able to look at who had its first name text up, so I just go around and start with Bertrand and then work my way through.
So I fully agree with your comment, Andreas. Fully concur with it. So would you suggest, or is there additional research you would suggest? No. No additional research? No. Nothing. Stop. So do you have any comments on the plan next step? Yes. First, keep focused. Partial matrix 1 approach. And that's all. Keep it simple. The more simple it will be, the more adherence from preparers you get, then the more it will serve the needs and the interest of users. And then it will enable us to do it quickly. That would be my sole advice. And there, it's where I totally agree with Nick, as already stated previously.
Sounds a little bit like Monopoly. Don't go directly to jail, right? Ginger.
Yes. Also, previously I mentioned to do some further research, but Aida said that actually we have done a lot of research, as I understand. Actually, I also agree. Do not take too much time to do additional outreach or research. But in terms of any expenses beyond the depreciation, amortization, and employee benefits could be specified. I think based on the current research you have done, as I mentioned before, maybe impairment losses could be included in this case, because I think this information could be easily available because based on our IS2 and IS36, and I think a lot of information already required to disclose. Secondly, in terms of whether we still need to have specific requirements for disclosure of those total numbers, as I mentioned before, obviously users need disaggregation numbers of those expenses by nature, but don't forget those aggregated numbers still useful. So I think totals for those expenses, nature expenses, I think still need to be included in our requirements. Secondly, we also said that paragraph 84B2, that should this specific requirement be limited to the totals of specified nature expenses. Previously agree, but after listening to the points made by Bruce, if some companies do provide additional total numbers of some nature expenses, I think we should allow them. So one way is, can we just silent, or we specific, or should it be limited to those total numbers we identify, we specified? I think we need to think about it in the future. Maybe another way is silent. If those companies, we just ask them to disclose those total numbers of depreciation, amortization, benefit, employee benefits, or maybe impairment losses. But if they disclose additional, they are allowed to disclose additional total numbers. But once we say, well, the specific requirements should be limited to those total numbers we required, maybe I think we can explore a little bit further on this question in terms of what Bruce mentioned before. I think maybe we can think about this kind of a situation. In terms of paragraph 84C, we mentioned that another way, say we need the best way to avoid a requirement of a full matrix, or should the ISB keep the general requirement in place together with a cost relief. I wonder, here we also mention again a cost relief. What kind of cost relief? We might undue cost. All right. Okay. Okay. That will be
because
helpful.
lots of assumption in the paper has been, it just doesn't apply. But another way is to say it continues to apply, but you have a cost relief that you apply as well and use, and that maybe balances better what I understood Bruce was saying earlier. But perhaps is not responsive to the argument for simplicity from some others. So that's a discussion that you have to have.
Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah. Another point about whether we need to separately identify specific expenses relating to your selling expenses. I think, because I think the nature of the selling expenses is different from general and administrative expenses. So from my perspective, I think it's worthwhile to explore to separate selling expenses. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Anne?
When you talk about additional research, which you may not be talking about after the end of this discussion, are you referring just to the 100 entities you've already got the annual reports and you're looking into that 100, in Appendix C, to talk about your 100 companies that you've been looking at?
Exactly. That was the research that we've done for this paper. We have already lined up and we'll analyze 550 foreign filers.
Okay, you're going to do that
from the US. So there is research already been done, and we just have to do the analysis and see if that kind of maybe backs some of the ideas of maybe possibly including impairments in this partial matrix 1. Exactly.
Okay.
But the 100 sample companies we have already analyzed, so we would not go back to them again.
No, that's what I was just wanting to clarify what you're actually looking at, but you're looking at the 500 FPIs.
Exactly.
Okay, great. I'm very reluctant to bring up this, but I've just noticed that sometimes in the feedback, the R&D was brought up as a line item. Now, I don't know how that fits with what Nick said about the connection between profit and loss, and I don't want to introduce more work, and so maybe we just don't want to talk about it. But is that correct? I've seen that somewhere as we've looked. People have raised it as that would be a good line item. Maybe we just don't want to talk about that.
But is it fair to say, because with partial matrix 1, if we say you shall show the segregation of these specified nature expenses by function, to the extent you have R&D as a function, then that gets automatically captured, right? And what Nick and Zach, not to put words in your mouth, but I understand it's very important because of different capitalization policies and so on. So investors want to know, I think that's a particularly useful point, how much depreciation, for example, and amortization has gone into that, but that gets kind of captured to the extent it's a separate function, which we expect would be when this.
Yeah, so that's typically what we see for a pharma company, that would be a separate function. Hence, it would have the same disaggregation as the other functions.
All right, thank you.
It was good to notice lots of them provide this disclosure today already, right? As they were happy to say.
Okay, so when you come back on the paper, and we've had a bit of discussion about totals, do you have to have any special consideration for tagging for digital, or because we are talking about totals, that we shouldn't have that situation where they're the line items, but there is a total missing. So that shouldn't be an issue with what we're talking about here?
Well, I think this is back to, again, Nick, the point you were making earlier, or was it someone else, the same partial matrix one less itself better to totals? Yes. So you almost automatically, you get the totals for whatever you've specified. So it almost goes without saying that there shall be a separate, well, again, don't want to prejudge the outcomes, but probably better to list it as separate requirements so that you get that total, so you don't get confusion, which sometimes happens in digital today. You tag a portion of depreciation and somehow it gets misconstrued as a total depreciation. So I think we need to be very careful to.
So can you give us a comment to tell us that is addressed, that the digital consideration is addressed as we're setting this out, the requirements?
It's been considered, and we think it's
Okay. And finally, I did notice in Appendix D, I think it is, some comments about FASB restarting their disaggregation and looking again at having to change their work because they're changing the objective and the scope of what they're doing. So am I right in assuming that their work is different to what we're trying to do here, and they're really we're not going to be able to at this stage learn anything from what they're doing that's relevant to what we're doing here?
I mean, to say we wouldn't learn is maybe, I mean, we have already had discussions with the staff just to see where they are, and, you know, that they are following very closely. I suspect they're listening to this meeting as well. But it's, yes, so to the extent there is something we are including, but the stage they're at is a beginning stage. And again, I think with other here, especially the regulatory context is quite relevant, because in the US it's quite specified. It's specified outside FASB what line items are. There is no equivalent of IS1. There's no concept of nature function. There are simply prescribed line items. So the whole context is quite different. So even, you know, you can't just lift something up because we have to translate it to the IS1 environment and then all of that. But yeah. Today we are continuing to monitor. When I say we, I mean Nick, primary, and we will include and report anything that's needs to be considered.
Thank you, Mary.
In terms of the specific question, is there anything beyond the items that you've enumerated in paragraph 84, and that isn't necessarily additional research, but questions that have to be answered? No, I don't. There's nothing more. I say, could you also do X or look at Y? And I think you've identified the right questions that we'd have to be specific about if we were pursuing these with the list of questions in paragraph 84. I want to offer a comment about paragraph 84C, which and one is an observation about a preference. I think if we're, given the discussion that we had today, I would pursue only the, would not, the approach of would not apply in addition to the specific requirements, say the specific requirements in effect substitute as a minimum, that's the implicit, yes, of course, you can still do a full matrix, but, it satisfies the minimum that you need to do rather than also complying with that. I would not pursue having alternatively, you could do the overall general with some cost relief, because then we'll have the discussion about which cost relief, how, is it an entity specific or not? So I would not pursue that. But going back to something I think Anne said in relation to the earlier question, I think we should not characterize it as this is all the information that we consider to be material, but rather it is we have considered both what is likely to be material with the cost of providing that information and have deliberately sought to provide some cost relief, and therefore have specified X requirements. And in effect, the practical expedient is if you do the minimum that we specify, then you've satisfied that requirement, rather than pretending that that's everything that's material.
Thanks.
Sure. I guess my two comments. One would be really quick, is if you could at least touch on restructuring costs in the next paper and why those would or would not be included, at the risk of adding things. The second thing is going back to Nick's comment about what users will use this for. And I think that complexity of working across the different financial statements is the key. This is the bridge. And D2 hints at one of the potential dangers, which is if you were to get a less disaggregated breakout in this matrix than exists on the face, you lose the ability to do that analysis. So for example, if there were to be 3 line items, 3 functions on the face of the primary financial statement, but is only bridged into 1 or 2 in the note, that destroys the ability to do what the users are trying to do. And a perfect example that I think we're going to take on with the cash flow project is frequently depreciation and amortization are scrunched together in the cash flow statement. And suddenly users say, I've got nothing. I can do nothing with them because it's two distinct things and I can't break them apart now. So I would put some thought into whether we specify minimums and materiality thresholds. I could be misreading D2, but that was the one danger I read into that is we want to make sure that that interrelationship isn't lost through aggregation after the primary financial statement. I think there's a difference between immaterial categories and combining categories.
And Zach, does it go the other way as well? Because, and I think thinking especially of the selling where you may have company doing SG&A, and I don't know, we still haven't discussed it specifically, but you may have combination of the functions on the face in order to say, well, this is what I need to meet the role of primaries and to have this understandable summary. But actually, when I think of materiality, I need to separate selling from the other functions. And then, you know, I would interpret what we're talking about with partial matrix 1 to apply to material functions as opposed to apply to functions as presented on face, in which case you would get linkages to the lower level of detail. And is that something that we need to keep in mind that's maybe bothersome for you? You prefer that to be one-on-one and forget about this aggregation potentially that can happen?
I think if it's material, then it's great to be able to deal with that level of information. I think if you could look into it and make sure there's not something I'm missing where it would get unmanageable for companies or impose significant additional costs, then I think it's worth looking into.
And with restructuring, wouldn't the common discussion we just had with Anne on R&D, wouldn't that apply in the same way to the extent restructuring is presented as a separate function? Anything that's specified in partial matrix 1, if the board were to confirm it, then you would get that information. Or were you looking for something additional in relation to restructuring for us to consider?
I was thinking of it more as where it's occasionally contained within other functions.
It's often that the restructuring costs or the restructuring expenses, they are presented by nature, even if the P&L is presented itself by function. But that's the reason why it was important not to prohibit a mixed presentation of by function, by nature on the face of the P&L, because often restructuring costs, they are presented by nature already on the P&L, and hence breakdown in the notes by segments based on by nature. But maybe you can do additional research not additional research. Sorry, no, not additional research. No. Sorry. I correct myself. All of a sudden, you can brought up the research you've already done in this regard to confirm that, or because if it's already the case, then I think it answers mechanically Zach's comments or concern.
Thank you, Andreas. I think that as all the board members said, you got the right questions here. Very good question, by the way. And when we discussed the question 1 and question 2, I have the question 84C all the time in my mind. I all the time was trying to say, okay, depreciation, amortization, personal costs, and if there is something else that is material, it's impossible that I could. Every time that we discuss, I have this in mind. When Rika and Jin Chao mentioned specific industries and etc., where this information might not necessarily be the material one, but it's a very good point that Andreas made, and reinforcing what actually Nick said. What is exactly the reason for the users to get this information? And then I think that we should ask this one, try to understand how to operate this one. But one thing that I would and I didn't see on letter D, is illustrative example. I don't know whether we are thinking about including illustrative example, and we shouldn't actually underestimate the power of a very good illustrative example.
Giving full matrix type of.
And then in this case, my illustrative would be a full matrix. I wouldn't include the worst.
By segments, right?
Yeah, no,
By CGU.
I agree. I think it's too much. But it's what I'm trying to say is that that's not, if we are going to include an example, let's not include an example. That is the minimum. Good example that we should include. And then I would include a full matrix example. And then if you want to put a second one, include depreciation, amortization, personal costs, and for example, restructuring, something else, just to show that and stimulate management to provide something else without answering the question 84C. Let's assume that if we just work with depreciation, amortization, employee costs, I just would work with the illustrative examples. They are very powerful, especially when they are good. Thank you.
You're saying example in the next agenda, you mean?
And in
in the standard.
Yeah, but if in the standard we do not prescribe more than partial metrics 1, I don't see an example that can go beyond that. I'm sorry, Tadeo, it's impossible.
No, it's okay. I mean that we
no. It's really impossible.
Okay. You don't have to vote now.
I think that would be a good example.
Thank you.
I don't need no further research. Just want to see how you put your ideas in one box for drafting the final standard. So that's what I want. And then also, I really don't want to lose the existing good practice to disclose disaggregating the operating expense information of total operating expense, and something very similar to what we propose in ED. So I think one thing I want staff to think about is how we can hold the principle of disaggregation regarding this operating expense analysis, and then how we can implement the idea of the cost constraints, and then making some option for the company to use as an exemption or allowing the entity to use. I understand that that might make diversity in disclosure information, but still we can make some progress and bring much better practice than what we've seen in most companies' financial statement. So just, that's something I want staff to think about that. And then about Anne's comment on intangibles, R&D, I just wondering that can be put in our future project of the intangible, to think about how the company improves disclosure or presentation in connection with those type of things. So yeah, that will be a kind of the future item we can explore, but not within the scope of this project.
Okay, I think heard all board members, almost all board members speak. Any final words from your end?
No, not really. We look forward to posting the next paper.
We look forward.
Hope we can incorporate all the comments and suggestions made.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I think just for the benefit